Welcome back to your next chapter in the History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. I'm Nicholas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time. Again, darkness gathered round, and danger threatened the Protestant church. Two terrible storms hung lowering in the skies of the world. The one darkened in the east, and the other was seen rising in the west. It was the eastern tempest that would be the first to burst, men thought, and the inhabitants of Germany turned their eyes in that direction, and watched with alarm and trembling the progress of the cloud that was coming toward them. The gates of Asia had opened, and had poured out the fierce Tartar hordes on a new attempt to submerge the rising Christianity and liberty of the West under a flood of Eastern barbarism. Traversing Hungary, the Ottoman horse had sat down before the walls of Vienna a week before the Marburg Conference. The hills around that capital were white with their tents, and the fertile plains beneath its walls, which the hoof of the Mussulman horse had never pressed till now, were trodden by their cavalry. The besiegers were opening trenches, were digging mines, and thundering with their cannons, and already a breach had been made in the walls. A few days, and Vienna must come to the numbers. The impetuosity and valor of the Ottoman warriors, and a desolate and blood-besprinkled heap, would alone remain to mark where it had stood. The door of Germany burst open. The conquerors would pour along the valley of the Danube and plant a crescent amid the sacked cities and devastated provinces of the empire. The prospect was a terrible one. The common ruin, like an avalanche on the brow of Alp, hung suspended above all parties and ranks in Germany, and might at any moment sweep down upon them with restless fury. "It is you," said the adherents of the old creed, addressing the Lutherans, "who have brought this scourge upon us. It is you who have loosed these angels of evil. They come to chastise you for your heresy. You have cast off the yoke of the Pope, and now you must bear the yoke of the Turk." "Not so," said Luther. "It is God who has unloosed this army, whose king is Abaddon, the destroyer. They have been sent to punish us for our sins, our ingratitude for the gospel, our blasphemies, and above all, our shedding of the blood of the righteous." Nevertheless, it was his opinion that all Germans ought to unite against the Sultan for the common defense. It was no question of leagues or offensive war, but of country and common safety. The Turk was at the hearth, and as neighbor assists neighbor whose house is on fire, so Protestant ought to aid Papists in repelling a foe that was threatening both with a common slaughter. It was at this time that he preached his battle sermon. Its sound was like the voice of a great trumpet. Did ever general address words more energetic to his soldiers when about to engage in battle? "Mohammed," said he, "exalts Christ as being without sin, but he denies that he is the true God. He is therefore his enemy. Alas, to this hour the world is such that it seems to reign disciples of Mohammed. Two men ought to oppose the Turks. The first is the Christian, that is to say, prayer. The second is Charles, that is to say, the sword. I know my dear Germans well. Fat and well-fed swine as they are, no sooner is their danger removed than they think only of eating and sleeping. Wretched man, if thou dost not take up arms, the Turk will come. He will carry thee away into his Turkey. He will set thee like a dog, and thou shalt serve him night and day, under the rod and the cudgel, for a glass of water and a morsel of bread. Think on this, be converted, and implore the Lord not to give thee the Turk for thy schoolmaster. Western freedom had never perhaps been in such extreme peril since the time when Xerxes led his myriad army to invade Greece. But the terrible calamity of the Ottoman subjugation was not to befall Europe. The Turk had reached the furthest limits of his progress westward. From this point, his slaughtering hordes were to be rolled back, while the cities and provinces of Germany waited in terror the tramp of his war horses and the gleam of his scimitars. There came the welcome tidings that the Asiatic warriors had sustained a severe repulse before Vienna, 16th October, 1529, and were now in full retreat to the Bosphorus. The scarcity of provisions to which the Turkish camp was exposed, and the early approach of winter, with its snowstorms, combined to effect the raising of the siege and the retreat of the invaders. But Luther recognized in this unexpected deliverance the hand of God and the answer of prayer. "We Germans are always snoring," he exclaimed, indignant at some whose gratitude was not so lively as he thought it ought to have been. "And there are many traitors among us. Pray," he wrote to Myconius, "against the Turk and the gates of hell, that as the angel could not destroy one little city for the sake of one just soul in it, so we may be spared for the sake of the few righteous that are in Germany." But if eastern cloud had rolled away and was fast vanishing in the distance, the one in the west had grown bigger than ever and was coming rapidly onwards. "We have two Caesars," said Luther, "one in the east and one in the west, and both are our foes. The emperor is again victorious over the league which his enemies had formed against him. He has defeated the King of France. He has taught Henry of England to be careful of falling a second time into the error he committed in the affair of Cognac. He chastised the Pope, and compelled Clement VII to sue for peace with a great ransom and the offer of alliance. And now he looks round him and sees no opponent save one, and that one apparently the weakest of all. That opponent swept from his path, he will mount to the pinnacle of power. Surely he who has triumphed over so many kings will not have to lower his sword before a monk. The emperor has left Spain in great wrath. He is on his way to chastise those audacious Protestants, who are now, as he believes, fully in power. The terror of the Turk was forgotten in the more special and imminent danger that threatened the lives of the religion of the Protestants. The Emperor Charles, said Luther, was determined to show himself more cruel against us than the Turk himself, and he has already uttered the most horrible threats. Behold the hour of Christ's agony and weakness. Let us pray for all those who will soon have to endure captivity and death. Meanwhile, the work at Wittenberg, despite the gathering clouds and the mutterings of the distant thunder, does not for one moment stand still. Let us visit this quiet retreat of learned men and scholars. In point of size, this Saxon town is much inferior to many of the cities of Germany. Neither among its buildings is there palatial edifice, nor in its landscape is there any remarkable object to attract the eye and awaken the admiration of the visitor. Yet what a power it is putting forth! Here those mighty forces are at work which are creating the new age. Here is the fountainhead of those ideas which are agitating and governing all classes, from the man who is master of half the kingdoms of the world, to the soldier who fights in the ranks, and the serf who tills the soil. In autumn of 1529, Matthias, the biographer of Luther, became a student in the renowned university. The next Sabbath after his admission, at Vespers, he heard the great man Dr. Luther preach from the words of St. Peter in Acts 2:38, enjoining repentance and baptism. What a sermon from the lips of the man of God, for which all the days of his pilgrimage on earth and throughout eternity he should have to give God thanks. At that point, Melanchthon lectured on Cicero's De Oratoribus and his oration Pro Archia, and before noon on the Epistle to the Romans, and every Wednesday on Aristotle's Ethics. Bergenhagen lectured on the epistles of the Corinthians, Jonas on the Psalms, Aragalis on Hebrew grammar, Freimar on Greek, Tulik on Cicero's offices, Bach on Virgil, Volmar on the theory of planets, Moloch on astronomy, and Cruciger on Terence for the younger students. There were besides private schools for the youth of the town and its neighborhood, which were in vigorous operation. Over and above his lecture in the university and his sermons in the cathedral, the reformer toiled with his pen to spread the Protestant light over Germany and countries more remote. A boon beyond all price was his German Bible, in style so idiomatic and elegant, and in rendering so faithful, that the Prince of Anhalt said it was as if the original penman had lived in Germany and used the tongue of the fatherland. Luther was constantly adding to the obligations his countrymen owed him for this priceless treasure by issuing new editions carefully revised. He wrote, moreover, expositions on several of the epistles, commentaries on the prophets. He was at this moment busy on Daniel. He had prefixed an explanatory preface to the Apocalypse, and his commentary on Jeremiah was soon to follow. Nor must we omit the humblest, but not the least useful, of all the works which issued from his study, his smaller and larger catechisms. When we pause to contemplate these two men, Luther and Charles, can we have the slightest doubt in saying which is immeasurably the greater? The one sitting in his closet sends forth his word, which runs speedily throughout the earth, shaking into ruin ancient systems of superstition to which the ages have done reverence, rending the shackles from conscience, and saying to the slave, "Be thou free," giving sight to the blind, raising up the fallen, and casting down the mighty, leading heart captive, and plucking up or planting kingdoms. It is a godlike power which he exercises. We turn to the emperor in his gorgeous palace, editing his edicts and dispatching them by liveried couriers to distant nations. We feel that we have made an immense stride downward. We have descended to a lower region, where we find a totally different and far inferior set of forces at work. Before Charles can effect anything, he must get together an army. He must collect millions of treasure. He must blow his trumpet and beat his kettle drums. And yet how little that is really substantial does he reap from all this noise and expense and blood. Another province or city, it may be, calls him master, but waits for the first opportunity to throw off his yoke. His sword has effaced some of the old landmarks on the earth's surface, and has traced a few new ones. But what truth has he established, which may mold the destinies of men, and be a fountain of blessing in ages to come? What fruit does Spain or the world reap today from all the battles of Charles? It is now that we see which of the two men wielded real power, and which of the two the true monarch was. The emperor was on his way to Germany, where he was expected next spring. He had made peace with Francis. He had renewed his alliance with the Pope. The Turk had gone back to his own land. It was one of those moments in the life of Charles when fortune shed her golden beams upon his path and beckoned him onwards to the flattering hope that now he was on the eve of attaining that summit of his ambition. One step more, one little remaining obstruction swept away, and then he would stand on the pinnacle of power. He did not conceal his opinion that that little obstruction was Wittenberg, and that the object of his journey was to make an end of it. But in consummating his grand design, he must observe the constitutional forms to which he had sworn at his coronation as emperor. The cradle of the Reformation was placed precisely in that part of his dominions where he was not absolute master. Had it been placed in Spain, in Flanders, anywhere, in short, except Saxony, how easy would it have been to execute the Edict of Worms? But in Germany he had to consult the will of others, and so he proceeded to convoke another diet at Augsburg. Charles must next make sure of the Pope. He could not have the crafty Clement tripping him up the moment he turned his back and crossed the Alps on his way to Germany. He must go to Italy and have a personal interview with the Pontiff. Setting sail from Spain and coasting along on the waters of the Mediterranean, the imperial fleet cast anchor in the Bay of Genoa. The youthful emperor gazed, doubtless, with admiration and delight on the city of the Dorias, whose superb palaces, spread out in concentric rows on the face of the mountains, embosomed in orange and oleander groves, rise from the blue sea to the summit of the craggy and embattled Apennines. The Italians, on the other hand, trembled at the approach of their new master, whose picture, as drawn by their imaginations, resembled those Gothic conquerors who in former times had sacked the cities and trampled into the dust the fertility of Italy. Their fears were dispelled, however, when on stepping ashore they beheld in Charles not an irate and ferocious conqueror, come to chastise them for their revolt, but a pale-faced prince, of winning address and gentle manners, followed by a train of nobles in the gay costume of Spain, and, like their master, courteous and condescending. This amiable young man, who arrived among the Italians in smiles, could frown sternly enough on occasion, as the Protestant deputies, who were at the moment on their way to meet him, were destined to experience. The Reformed princes, who gave in the famous protest to the Diet of Spires 1529, followed up their act by an appeal to the emperor. The Archduke Ferdinand, the president of the Diet, stormed and left the assembly, but the protesters appealed to a general council and to posterity. Their ambassadors were now on their way to lay the great protest before Charles. 3 burgesses, marked rather by their weight of character than by their eminence of position, had been selected for this mission. Their names were John Einger, burgomaster of Memmingen; Michael Caden, syndic of Nuremberg; and Alexis Frontrat, secretary to the Margrave of Brandenburg. Their mission was deemed a somewhat dangerous one, and before their departure a pension was secured to their widows in case of misfortune. They met the emperor at Piacenza, for so far had he got on his way to meet the Pope at Bologna, to which city Clement had retired, to benefit, it may be, after his imprisonment, by its healthy breezes, and to forget the devastation inflicted by the Spaniards on Rome, of which the daily sight of its plundered museums and burned palaces reminded him while he resided in the capital. Informed of the arrival of the Protestant deputies and of the object of their journey, Charles appointed the 12th of September for an audience. The prospect of appearing in the imperial presence was no pleasant one, for they knew that they had come to plead for a cause which Charles had destined to destruction. Their fears were confirmed by receiving an ominous hint to be brief, and not preach a Protestant sermon to the emperor. Unabashed by the imperial majesty and the brilliant court that waited upon Charles, these three plain ambassadors, when the day of audience came, discharged their mission with fidelity. They gave a precise narrative of all that had taken place in Germany on the matter of religion since the emperor quitted that country, which was in 1521. They especially instanced the Edict of Toleration promulgated by the Diet of 1526, the virtual repeal of that edict by the Diet of 1529, the protest of the Reformed princes against that repeal, their challenge of religious freedom for themselves and all who should adhere to them, and their resolution, at whatever cost, to withdraw from that demand, but to prosecute their protest to the utmost of their power. In all matters of the empire, they would most willingly obey the emperor, but in the things of God they would obey no power on earth. So they spoke. It was no pleasant thing, verily, for the victor of kings and the ruler of two hemispheres to be thus plainly taught that there were men in the world whose wills even he, with all his power, could not bend. This thought was the worm at the root of the emperor's glory. Charles deigned no reply. He dismissed the ambassadors with the intimation that the imperial will would be made known to them in writing. On the 13th of October, the emperor's answer was sent to the deputies through his secretary, Alexander Schweiss. It was, in brief, that the emperor was well acquainted, through his brother Ferdinand and his colleagues, with all that had taken place in Germany, that he was resolved to maintain the edict of the last Diet of Spires, that namely which abolished the toleration inaugurated in 1526, and which laid the train of the extinction of the religious movement, and that he had written to the Duke of Saxony and his associates commanding them to obey the decree of the Diet, upon the allegiance which he owed to him and to the empire, and that should he disobey, he would be necessitated for the maintenance of his authority, and for example's sake to punish him. Guessing too truly what the emperor's answer would be, the ambassadors had prepared an appeal from it beforehand. This document they now presented to the secretary Schweiss in presence of witnesses. They had some difficulty in persuading the official to carry it to his master, but at length he consented to do so. We can imagine how the emperor's brow was darkened as he read it. He ordered Schweiss to go and arrest the ambassadors, till the imperial pleasure should be further made known to them. They were not to stir out of doors, nor to write to their friends in Germany, nor permit any of their servants to go abroad, under pain of forfeiture of goods and life. It was chanced that one of the deputies, Caden, was not in the hotel when the emperor's orders, confining the deputies to their lodgings, arrived. His servant slipped out and told him what had happened in his absence. The deputy, sitting down, wrote an account of the affair, their interview with the emperor, and his declared resolution to execute the Edict of Worms, to the Senate at Nuremberg, and dispatching it by a trusty messenger, whom he charged to proceed with all haste on his way, he walked straight to the inn to share the arrest of his colleagues. Unless the compulsion of conscience comes in, mankind in the mass will be found too selfish and too apathetic to purchase, at the expense of their own toil and blood, the heritage of freedom for their children. Liberty says we may, religion says we must, die rather than submit. It is a noble sentiment of the poet, and finely expressed, that freedom's battle bequeathed from bleeding sire to son, though often lost, is always won in the end, but therewith does not accord the fact. The history of Greece, of Rome, and of other nations shows us, on a large view of matters, liberty dissociated from religion is fighting a losing and not a winning battle. The more prominent instance, though not the only one, in modern times is France. There we behold a brave nation fighting for liberty, in contradistinction to, or rather as dissociated from religion, and after a conflict of nearly a century, liberty is not yet rooted in France. The little Holland is an instance on the other side. It fought a great battle for religion, and in winning it won everything else besides. The only notable examples with which history presents us of great masses triumphant over established tyrannies are those of the primitive Christians and the reformers of the 16th century. Charles V would have walked at will over Christendom, treading all rights and aspirations into the dust, had any weaker principle than conscience, evoked by Protestantism, confronted him at this epoch. The first to scale the fortress of despotism are ever the champions of religion. The champions of civil liberty, coming after, enter at the breach which the others had opened with their lives. Setting out from Piacenza on the 23rd of October, the emperor went on to meet the Pope at Bologna. He carried with him the 3 Protestant deputies as his captives. Traveling by slow stages, he gave ample time to the Italians to mark the splendor of his retinue, and the number and equipments of his army. The city he was now approaching had already enjoyed 2 centuries of eminence. Bologna was the seat of the earliest of those universities which arose in Europe when the light of learning began again to visit its sky. The first foundation of this school was in A.D. 425 by Theodosius the Younger. It rose to eminence under Charlemagne, and attained its full splendor in the 15th century, when the scholastic philosophy began to give place to more rational studies, and the youth of many lands flocked in thousands to study within its walls. In this respect, of this seat of learning that Bologna stamps on its coin, Bononia docet, to which is added, in its coat of arms, Libertas. Bologna was the second city in the states of the Church, and was sometimes complimented with the epithet Sister of Rome. It rivaled the capital in the number and sumptuousness of its monasteries and churches. One of the latter contains the magnificent tomb of Saint Dominic, the founder of the order of Inquisitors. It is remarkable for its 2 towers, both ancient even in the days of Charles, the A. Sanelli and the Garisenda, which lean like the Tower of Pisa. Besides its ecclesiastical buildings, the city boasted not a few palatial edifices and monuments. One of these had already received Pope Clement under its roof. Another was prepared for the reception of the emperor, whose sumptuous train was on the road. The site of Bologna is a commanding one. It leans against an Apennine, on whose summit rises the superb monastery of St. Michael in Bosco, and at its feet, stretching far to the south, are those fertile plains whose riches has earned for the city the appellation of Bologna Grassa. While the emperor, with an army of 20,000 behind him, advances by slow marches and is drawing nigh to its gates, let us turn to the Protestants of Germany. Chapter 19. Meeting between the Emperor and Pope at Bologna. Meeting of Protestants at Schmalkald. Complete agreement in matters of faith insisted on. Failure to form a defensive league. Luther's views on war. Division among the Protestants overruled. The Emperor at Bologna. Interviews between Charles and Clement. The Emperor proposes a council. The Pope recommends the sword. Campeggio and Gattinera. The Emperor's secret thoughts. His coronation. Accident. San Petronio and its spectacle. Rites of coronation. Significance of each. The Emperor sets out for Germany. On almost the same day on which Charles set out from Piacenza, Caden's letter, telling what reception the Emperor had given their deputies, reached the Senate of Nuremberg. It created a profound sensation among the councillors. Their message had been repulsed, and their ambassadors arrested. This appeared to the Protestants tantamount to a declaration of hostilities on the part of the powerful and irate monarch. The Elector of Saxony and the Landgrave of Hesse consulted together. They resolved to call a meeting of the Protestant princes and cities at an early day, to deliberate on the crisis that had arisen. The assembly met at Schmalkald on November 29, 1529. Its members were the Elector of Saxony, his son, John Frederick, Ernest and Francis, Dukes of Luneburg, Philip the Landgrave, the deputies of George, Margrave of Brandenburg, with representatives from the cities of Strasbourg, Ulm, Nuremberg, Heilbronn, Beutlingen, Constance, Memmingen, Kempten, and Lindau. The sitting of the assembly was marked by a striking incident. The Emperor having released 2 of the ambassadors, and the third, Caden, having contrived to make his escape, they came to Schmalkald just as the Protestants had assembled there, and electrifying them by their appearance in the Diet, gave a full account of all that had befallen them at the court of the Emperor. Their statement did not help to abate the fears of the princes. It convinced them that evil was determined, that it behooved them to prepare against it, and the first and most effectual preparation, one would have thought, was to be united among themselves. The necessity of union was felt, but unhappily it was sought in the wrong way. The assembly put the question, which shall we first discuss and arrange, the matter of religion or the matter of defense? It was resolved to take the question of religion first, for, said they, unless we are one mind on it, we cannot be united in the matter of defense. Luther and his friends had recently revised the articles of the Marburg Conference in a strictly Lutheran sense. This revised edition is known as the Schmalkald Articles. Under the 10th head, a very important change was introduced. It was affirmed, without any ambiguity, that the very body and blood of Christ are present in the sacrament, and the notion was condemned that the bread is simply bread. This was hardly keeping faith with the Reformed section of Christendom, but the blunder that followed was still greater. The articles so revived were presented to the deputies at Schmalkald, and their signatures demanded to them as the basis of a political league. Before combining for their common defense, all must be of one mind on the doctrine of the Lord's Supper. This course was simply deplorable. Apart from religious belief, there was enough of clear political ground on which to base a common resistance to a common tyranny. But in those days, the distinction between the citizen and the church member, between the duties and rights appertaining to the individual and his political and religious character, was not understood. All who would enter the proposed league must be of one mind on the tenet of consubstantiation. They must not only be Protestant, but Lutheran. The deputies from Strasbourg and Ulm resisted this sectarian policy. We cannot sign these articles, said they, but are willing to unite with our brethren in a defensive league. The Landgrave of Hesse strongly argued that difference of opinion respecting the manner of Christ's presence in the sacrament did not touch the foundations of Christianity or endanger the salvation of the soul, and ought not to divide the Church of God, much less ought that difference to be made ground of exclusion from such a league as was now proposed to be formed. But the Dukes of Saxony and Luneburg, who were strongly under Luther's influence, would hear no confederation but with those who were ready to take the religious test. Ulm and Strasbourg withdrew. The conference broke up, having first resolved that such as held Lutheran views, and only such, should meet at Nuremberg in the January following, to concert measures for resisting the apprehended attack of the Emperor and the Pope. Thus the gulf between the Lutheran and the Reformed churches was deepened at an hour when every sacrifice, short of the principle of Protestantism itself, ought to have been made to close it. It was the views of Luther which triumphed at these discussions. He had beforehand strongly impressed his sentiments upon the Elector John, and both he and the Margrave of Brandenburg had come to be very thoroughly of one mind with regard to the necessity of being one in doctrine and creed before they could lawfully unite their arms for mutual defense. But to do Luther justice, he was led to the course he now adopted, not alone by his views on the sacrament, but also by his abhorrence of war. He shrank in horror from unsheathing the sword in any religious matter. He knew that the religious federation would be followed by a military one. He saw in the background armies, battles, and a great effusion of the blood of man. He saw the religious life decaying amid the excitement of camps. He pictured the spiritual force ebbing away from Protestantism, and the strong sword of the empire, in the issue, victorious over all. No, he said, let the sword rest in its scabbard. Let the only sword unsheathed in a quarrel like this be the sword of the Spirit. Let us spread the light. Our Lord Christ, wrote he to the Elector of Saxony, it is mighty enough, and can well find ways and means to rescue us from danger and bring the thoughts of the ungodly princes to nothing. The Emperor's undertaking is a loud threat of the devil, but it will be powerless, as the Psalm says. It will fall on his own pate. Christ is only trying us whether we are willing to obey his word or no, and whether we hold it for certain truth or not. We had rather die 10 times over than that the gospel should be a cause of blood or hurt by any act of ours. Let us rather patiently suffer, and as the psalmist says, be accounted as sheep for the slaughter, and instead of avenging or defending ourselves, leave room for God's wrath. If then Luther must make his choice between the sword and the stake, between seeing the Reformation triumph on the field of war and triumph on the field of martyrdom, he infinitely prefers the latter. The Protestant Church, like that of Rome, wars against error unto blood, but unlike Rome, she sheds not the blood of others, she pours out her own. Had the Lutheran princes and the Zwinglian chiefs at this hour united in a defensive league, they would have been able to have brought a powerful army into the field. The enthusiasm of the soldiers, as well as their numbers, was to be counted on in a trial of strength between them and their opponents. The German princes, who still remained on the side of Rome, they would have swept from the field. Even the legions of the emperor would have found it hard to withstand them. But to have transferred the cause of Protestantism at that epoch from the pulpit, from the university and the press to the battlefield would not have contributed to its final success. Without justifying Luther in the tenacity with which he clung to his dogma of consubstantiation, till Reformed Christendom was rent in twain, and without endorsing the judgment of the Schmalkald Conference, that men must be at one in matters of faith before they can combine for the defense of their political and religious rights, we must yet acknowledge that the division between the Lutheran and the Reformed, although deplorable in itself, was ruled to ward off a great danger from Protestantism, and to conduct it into a path where it was able to give far more sublime proofs of its heroism, and to achieve victories more glorious and more enduring than any it could have won by arms. It was marching on, though it knew it not, to a battlefield on which it was to win a triumph, the fruits of which Germany and Christendom are reaping at this hour. Not with confused noise and garments rolled in blood, was to be the battle which the Protestants were now advancing. No wail of widow, no cry of orphan was to mingle with the paeans of its victors. That battle was to give to history one of its memorable days. But both the Emperor and the Pope were to be routed. That great field was Augsburg. We return to Bologna, which in the interval has become the scene of dark intrigues and splendid feats. The saloons were crowded with gay courtier legates, bishops, archbishops, ministers, and secretaries. Men in Spanish and Italian uniforms parade the streets. The church bells are ceaselessly tolled, and the roll of the drum continually salutes the ear for religious ceremonies, and military shows proceed without intermission. The palaces in which the Pope and the Emperor lodged are so closely contiguous that a wall only separates the one from the other. The barrier has been pierced with a door which allows Charles and Clement to meet and confer at all hours of the day and night. The opportunity is diligently improved. While others sleep, they wake. Protestantism, it mainly is that occasions so many anxious deliberations and sleepless hours to these two potentates. They behold that despised principle exalting its stature strangely and ominously from year to year. Can no spell be devised to master it? Can no league be framed to bind it? It is then the hope of discovering some such expedient or enchantment that Clement and Charles so often summon their wise counselors by day, or meet in secret and consult together alone, when deep sleep rests on the eyelids of those around them. But in truth the Emperor brought to these meetings a double mind. Despite the oath he had taken on the confines of the ecclesiastical states never to encroach upon the liberties of the papal see, despite the lowly obeisance with which he saluted the Pope when Clement came forth to meet him at the gates of Bologna, and despite the edifying regularity with which he performed his devotions, Charles thought of the great Spanish monarchy of which he was the head in the first place, and the Pope in the second place. To tear up the Protestant movement by the roots would suit Clement admirably, but would it equally suit Charles? This was the question with the Emperor. He was now coming to see that to extinguish Luther would be to leave the Pope without a rival. Clement would then be independent of the sword of Spain, and would hold his head higher than ever. This was not for Charles's interests, or the glory of the vast empire over which his scepter was swayed. The true policy was to tolerate Wittenberg, taking care that it did not become strong, and play it off when occasion required against Rome. He would muzzle it, he would hold the chain in his hand, and have the unruly thing under his own control. Luther and Duke John and Landgrave Philip would dance when he piped, and mourn when he lamented, and when the Pope became troublesome, he would lengthen the chain in which he held the hydra of Lutheranism, and reduce Clement to submission by threatening to let loose the monster on him. By being umpire, Charles would be master. This was the Emperor's innermost thought, as we now can read it by his subsequent conduct. In youth, Charles was politic. it was not till his later years that he became a bigot. The statement of Charles's counsels were also divided on the point. The emperor was attended on this journey into Germany by two men of great experience and distinguished abilities, Campeggio and Gattinara, who advocated opposite policies. Campeggio was for dragging every Protestant to the stake and utterly razing Wittenberg. There is an instruction of his to the emperor still extant, discovered by the historian Banchi at Rome, in which this summary process is strongly recommended to Charles. If there be any, said the legate Campeggio in his instruction, referring to the German princes, if there be any, which God forbid, who will obstinately persist in this diabolical path, his majesty may put hand to fire and sword, and radically tear out this cursed and venomous plant. The first step in this process would be to confiscate property, civil or ecclesiastical, in Germany as well as in Hungary and Bohemia. For with regard to heretics, this is lawful and right. Is the mastery over them thus obtained? Then must holy inquisitors be appointed, who shall trace out every remnant of them, proceeding against them as the Spaniards did against the Moors in Spain. Such was the simple plan of this eminent dignitary of the Papal Church. He would set up the stake. Why should he not? And it would continue to blaze till there was not another Protestant in all Christendom to burn. When the last disciple of the gospel had sunk in ashes, then would the empire enjoy repose, and the church reign in her glory over a pacified and united Christendom. If a little heretical blood could procure so great a blessing, would not the union of Christendom be cheaply purchased? Not so did Gattinara counsel. He too would heal the schism and unite Christendom, but by other means. He called not for an army of executioners, but for an assembly of divines. You, Charles, are the head of the empire, said he. You, the Pope, the head of the Church. It is your duty to provide by common accord against unprecedented wants. Assemble the pious men of all nations, and let a free council deduce from the word of God a scheme of doctrine such as may be received by every people. The policies of the two counselors stood markedly distinct. The sword, a counsel. Clement VII was startled as if a gulf yawned at his feet. The word council has been a name of terror to the popes in all ages. The mention of it conjured up before the pontifical imagination an equal, or it might be a superior authority to their own, and so tended to obscure the glory and circumscribe the dominion of the papal chair. Pius IX had succeeded at last in laying that terrible bugbear by the decree of infallibility, which makes him absolute monarch of the Church. But in those ages, when the infallibility was assumed rather than decreed to be the personal attribute of the popes, no threat was more dreadful than the proposal, sure to be heard at every crisis, to assemble a council. But Clement had reason peculiar to himself for regarding the proposition with abhorrence. He was a bastard. He had got possession of his chair by means not altogether blameless, and he had squandered the revenues of his see upon his family inheritance of Florence, and a reckoning would be exceedingly inconvenient. Though Luther himself had suddenly entered the council chamber, Clement could not have been more alarmed and irritated than he was by the proposal of Gattinara. He did not see what good a council would do unless it were to let loose the winds of controversy all over Europe. It is not, said he, by the decrees of councils, but by the edge of the sword, that we should decide controversies. But Gattinara had not made his proposal without previous consultation with the emperor, whose policy it suited. Charles now rose, and indicated that his views lay in the direction of those of his minister, and the Pope, concealing his disgust, seeing how the wind set, said that he would think further on the matter. He hoped to work upon the mind of the emperor in private. These discussions were prolonged till the end of January. The passes of the Alps were now locked. Avalanches of snowdrifts threatened the man who would scale their precipice at that season, and the climate of Bologna was salubrious. Charles was in no haste to quit so agreeable an abode. The ecclesiastical potentate continued to advocate the sword, and the temporal monarch to call for a council. It is remarkable that all the Protestants to the scaffold was a serious. He was best acquainted. The sword will avail naught in this affair, urged the emperor. Let us vanquish our opponents in argument. Reason, exclaimed the Pope, will not serve our turn. Let us resort to force. But though all the consideration of humanity had been put aside, the question of the practicability of bringing all the Protestants to the scaffold was a serious one. Was the emperor able to do this? He stood at the head of Europe. But it was prudent not too severely to test his superiority. The Lutheran princes were by no means despicable, either in spirit or resources. The King of France and England, though they disrelished the Protestant doctrines, had come to know that the Protestant party was an important political element, and it was just possible their majesties might prefer that Christendom should remain divided, rather than that its unity should be restored by a holocaust like that advocated by Campeggio. And then there was the Turk, who, although he had now retreated to his own domain, might yet, should a void so vast occur as would be created by the slaughter of the Protestants, transfer standards from the shores of the Bosphorus to the banks of the Danube. It was clear that the burning of 100,000 Protestants or so would be only the beginning of the drama. The Pope would most probably approve of so kindly a blaze. But might it not end in setting other states besides Germany on fire, and the Spanish monarchy among the rest? Charles, therefore, stuck to his idea of a council, and being master, as Gattinara reminded him, he was able to have the last word in the conferences. Meanwhile, till a general council could be convened, and as preparatory to it, the emperor on the 20th of January, 1530, issued a summons for a diet of the states of Germany to meet at Augsburg on the 8th of April. The summons was couched in terms remarkably gracious, and surely if conciliation was to be attempted, at least as a first measure, it was wise to go about it in a way fitted to gain the object the emperor had in view. Let us put an end to all discord, said he. Let us renounce our antipathies. Let us all fight under one and the same leader, Jesus Christ, and let us strive thus to meet in one communion, one church, and one unity. What a relief to the Protestants of Germany! The great sword of the emperor, which had hung over their heads, suspended by a single thread, was withdrawn, and the olive branch was held out to them instead. The heart of kings is in the hand of God. Thank you all for taking your time to listen to the history of Protestantism. Please like this recording wherever it is that you are listening to it. And as a special favor, I ask you all to go to crosstheborder.org and click on the cover of the volume that you are listening to, which will take you to the appropriate Amazon page. And please leave a 5-star review there and a brief comment about something that you've heard or read in that volume. Thank you so much for taking that little bit of extra time to support us.